I think there's a variety of factors. Market performance on the assets is definitely having an impact there.
Okay.
So from that standpoint, I think it will come down.
Okay.
But them changing the discount rate and present valuing it at a lower discount rate is increasing the balance. So they would have to increase that rate, which means that they would think that the long-term investment balance or investment growth is going to occur at a higher level than it has been. So
So you don't get worried or excited about that.
I think with the pension, I think it's informational. It's an actuarial study based on these assumptions. So when they change the assumptions, it has a significant impact. What they're telling us is that we're underfunded at some level. And I think when we've had problems, in the past years with certain issues within there, there's kind of been an all hands on deck solution. So it's been like increasing rates, potentially changing benefits. The cities or the states contributed dollars into the fund to help shore it up. So it's not like they're going to be, well, I shouldn't say that. I doubt that they're going to come back and ask all the participants to start writing them checks. This is a long-term calculation, but I think we got to be ready for the fact that it could put additional pressure on the budget.
Thank you.
I'll just further clarify, we tend to understand pension rate contribution increases through the legislative session. So my understanding is the rates remain the same this last session. So generally that'll walk with the 2-year budget. So we're not anticipating any in the next 2-year window, but it's always subject to review by the Legislative Pension Commission. So we track that, but at this point, we're not projecting that our rates have increased it. Yeah.
Mayor Norton. So I have just a couple quick ones, and that was actually one of them. And just for clarity here, back in 2016, we saw something quite similar, a huge leap, and then a precipitous drop the next year. And it stayed relatively low and dropped even last year to the lowest we've seen in quite some time. So I'm just trying to understand that volatility. And, we've seen it drop right on our chart. And what factors or what things would we be looking for or be concerned about if it's not happening?
Right. So I'd have to go back, look specifically, but my recollection on 2016 was that there was an increase in the discount rate, which was definitely, a decrease in the discount rate, but then they raised it back up the following year. So it's like they calculated it and then they changed their mind. Okay. The volatility between then, I don't think was assumption changes. It was more market driven. Changes in investment values and so on. This last year was definitely in the police and fire, a significant increase there because of the lower discount rate. I don't know that you can really
Predict or know what.
Maybe somebody from Para coming and talking to the council about it might be a interesting exercise.
I'm sure. And I just have a couple other quick ones on the capital projects on the next slide after that, which I think was 29. I was looking through the list and maybe it just doesn't belong here, but I was thinking about the investment we're making in wastewater treatment, and I'm not seeing that anywhere. And it was a pretty substantial investment. So I just wondered where I would look for that.
So wastewater treatment is an enterprise fund, so that they account for everything in their fund.
Okay.
Different than these other activities, which are not user charge driven.
Okay.
That's how they work. So the reserves for the let's see, sewer utility here. So their cash balances, their fund balances, they have about $41 million in reserves at the end of the year. They have made significant investments. Like I mentioned earlier in 2021, we operated at a surplus, but our cash balances actually came down because we invested that in capital needs out of the treatment plant.
Okay, and that was actually my third one, is that slide, trying to understand the operating expenses being set aside to fund future stormwater improvements different than, is that the same or different than our wastewater treatment plant? I thought they were different.
Say that again, sorry.
The third bullet down, it says operating expenses are being set aside to fund future stormwater system improvements. And so that's kind of what I was looking for. Is that the same or a different fund than?
No, that's the same for sure.
That's the same one. Okay. And then the last is that same stormwater.
Yeah, the storm sewer and the sewer fund are distinct and separate.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. All right.
They operate
Well,
the same.
they operate the same, but they're
separate balances. The stormwater has its own money.
And it's not as visible here in the charts.
For stormwater?
For the wastewater, because it's an enterprise fund. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, it's not included in the CIP necessarily. It's got its own, but their reserves on this chart here on chart 36, they have about 41 million in cash reserves. Sewer fund,
Yes.
There's about 27 million for stormwater that's their money that they have set aside. So if you looked at it, you could say CIP, if they didn't have their money in their own funds, would have those dollar amounts set aside available for them.
Your Honor, just in kind of this space too, as we start to forecast the larger projects, there's a couple of other funding sources that are being explored. So there's sort of the state's low interest loan program. And then we have some fairly significant debt that ladders off in a couple of years. So that projection would sort of that would come off the books, but then we'd create capacity for the next investment in the fund. And I know Wendy and Aaron are doing a lot of work in that space.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We are going to look at loans and grants as well and using some of that fund. So it's a combination.
Great. I was just looking for that fund and I wasn't seeing it. I wanted to make sure it wasn't lost and that we were appropriately funding for it. It sounds like we are, just in different ways. And then the last thing was 38. It's on the same stormwater utility, the 337% unrestricted. Could you say again what the unrestricted cash investments, why we're comfortable? I mean, it's a huge amount
So
increase.
337. So it's basically, a lot of times we look at reserves based on what our operating costs, because we have to have a certain amount on hand for operating costs. But these funds generate additional dollars over and above what we need for operations for that capital piece that you're talking about.
Okay.
And so that's why the percentage seems so high.
Mhm.
There's a lot of capital dollars that are being set aside for future needs within both stormwater and sewer, RPU as well. You can see those amounts.
Perfect. Thank you. That was it.
Yeah, one more just context piece on that, like, Aaron and Troy will be talking to you about the surface water management plan in a moment, and some of our investment in stormwater has been held back, sort of waiting for this plan to get ratified, but then we have the ability then to roll forward on these projects with the accrued balance here.
All right, Councilmember Dennis.
So, well, thank you. This is very thorough and a lot of charts, so I appreciate that for many people. Yeah, I have 3 questions, and the first one is how and why was Smith Schaefer chosen as the independent auditor for the city of Rochester?
Maybe staff can answer that. Go ahead, Mr. Parrish.
Yeah, President Owners Council. So, we have a retained auditor, and we've, recently, and I think we will bring forward a recommendation to the council for a 2-year extension on this contract. Predominantly, particularly given some of the staffing transitions in finance and, the team sort of, needing some historical perspective, I think, we'll recommend that. But from time to time, we would go out for RFP and do that. I just think at this point in time, we're not recommending that given the need for some historical continuity. But in a couple of years after that extension, it's something we would consider recommending to you.
So it starts as a multi-year contract and then can be extended additional time before an additional RFP for bids.
Correct.
Okay. Sometimes fresh eyes are good. I think one of the things they did for fresh eyes, they contact, I believe every year, somebody to answer some questions. And a representative from Smith and Schaefer called me up over about a dozen questions prepared and extra questions. And one of the questions that she asked, and I kind of summarized it, but was how does the city council exercise its oversight of the city's assessment of fraud risk and the programs and controls of the city? What programs and controls of the city has to address these risks? And that's not exact words, but I don't want to read the whole, very long questions.
Sure.
And so I was kind of blown away by that. This is just one of many questions, because I'm like, well, a lot of us were elected during the pandemic. There wasn't really formalized training. What kind of training is given to city council, which I must have can't remember the training, or city staff to identify fraud?
So the purpose of the questions, and basically the questions are set aside for all types of governments that we deal with. Okay? And so the role of a council person in a small city, I think, is much different from a fraud perspective than the role of a council member in a large city like this that has a lot of employees, a lot of management that kind of put in the processes and the controls in place associated with that. Now, when it comes to training, I think every government could set up their own training program for new council members. I know our smaller cities, they offer programs at the league for new council members to go to, and there's some training that's done at that on a variety of things, not just financial. They cover a large area. I don't know if that would be beneficial to city council members or not. I don't know if we've looked at that in the past, but there could also be procedures, and there probably are. I think you guys can talk to that, existing procedures when new council people come in for orienting them. I mean, the city of Rochester is a very large
Yeah.
city, relatively speaking. There's a lot of activities, a lot of information. I covered, all of this. I don't think necessarily there's an expectation that you have a deep level understanding of everything, a deep dive in every area. That's why you hire city staff to help take care of those things, and then they bring the major decisions for council to
Okay.
look at. From a fraud perspective, I think inside for the city of Rochester, most of our efforts to deal with fraud are around controls, okay? Where people have to submit, we have approval processes, we have oversight, management, those types of things. Whereas if you're in a small city, they might be put upon the council people to actually look at when you have one person working in the city as a clerk or as administrator. They have to spend more time and activities around looking through financial reports, I guess is what I would say.
Okay, I appreciate it. A lot of things we sign off or vote off on. So I think having oversight, having a little bit more in-depth training on how we can be involved in that, I think might be good in the future. We did do some some of us did some League of Minnesota trainings on like conflict of interest and whatnot. That was another question. It was very long. It went into transactions, disclosures, a lot of balances, approvals. But the essence of the question was, how do you like relationships between people, entities, conflict of interest? And I brought up a few that I had some concerns with, which I won't share right here, but I do know that other staff have had concerns. I've had City of Rochester staff come to me one time in the parking lot of a grocery store and tell me some very concerning conflict of interest situations. And how does a city staff member, let's say we are seeing close to 1,000, who might have a concern about a conflict of interest in their department, so they might not want to go through the chain of, to address that. How can a city staff or, someone report issues in a confidential way that does not maybe notify?
Point of
employees?
order, this is an audit discussion,
Well, this was a question in the audit Smith and Schaefer sent to me.
but you're going way past audit discussion right now.
This was literally a question. that
I'll leave it to
Smith and
Spindler Craig to
Schaefer,
decide.
asked me to report on behalf of the council, so I don't think
I
it's a,
think the question is, if there is a concern with financials, is there a process that city staff or council members can make sure that those concerns are heard?
thank you.
Well, I don't know specifically on your policy on conflicts of interest and whistleblowers without going back and looking at it. But presumably there's a process for them to elevate to a department head. And if they don't feel comfortable with that, they should go outside to the department to the next level up to
Could they-
raise their concerns.
Could they contact Smith and Schaefer directly if they don't feel comfortable coming to anyone in
No.
the city?
They could.
They could. Okay, so that's a feasible thing for all employees of the city to directly contact the auditor.
I mean,
Okay.
we would prefer if, you would go through your normal process, but if they didn't feel like their concerns were being heard, they
Well-
could bring them to the auditor. We'd have to evaluate whether that concern was potentially material to the financial statements.
Can we move
there's a
on
lot
to the
of,
next question?
Yeah, well, those are my 3 questions.
All right.
That's all I have. Thank you so
All
much.
right, Councilmember Keen.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick here. Again, one thing I appreciate going through this is this idea of the municipal fund method, the special funds. And again, it takes a lot. I still look at a lot of government spending much more as sources and uses,
Yep.
and it makes it difficult with the fund perspective. The specific one that might help me is 2.5 years ago, we approved a municipal park and rec forestry, $2 million a year that we're collecting. And I'm trying to look at this and see how it comes into our fund balances, and I'm not seeing it. Can you help me? How does that become part of the capital? Because this group, this council moved a lot of it that way. Does it become part of park and rec, or how would it work with these special funds?
right? So the park and referendum, about $2 million. My understanding is it's going directly into the CIP fund for park projects. I guess I don't know specifically the authorization on the referendum, whether it can be used for operations or not, but Currently, that's all going toward capital.
Yeah, all
Is that
capital
fair?
at this point. I mean, and then as you move forward with the appropriation of the accelerated investment model, you'll have about half of it being programmed annually in the CIP, which you'll talk about briefly at your next study session. And then the other half will be allocated to debt service for the accelerated investment of 14 or $15 million of front end work.
So, okay, that's, I was trying to map that. And I know we as this council took, I believe it was a $14 million. I'm taking 1 million out of it for the next
20 years.
20 years. But I didn't realize the rest of it is going to CIP too. I thought there was an operations thing, but that's separate from the audit. I think I'll follow up separately with that. Thank you.
Any final questions or discussion? All right, thank you so much for your time and your energy and your team's work and our team's work. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Council President, in the interest of time, I would just ask Aaron Luckstein and team to come forward and get set up for the Surface Water Management Plan update.
Sounds good. Welcome, Aaron and Troy. How are we feeling about time? 35 minutes?
We can move through it quick, and if we need to, we can cut out a couple slides towards the end. We have quite a bit on the hydrologic and hydraulic modeling, and so
Okay.
we can move quicker through that.
This has been a long time coming. We want to make sure we're doing it justice. So how much time do you think you need?
30 minutes would, I think
Okay.
we can get through it in 30 minutes, 35. How much do you need for the final agenda item?
That can be short.
So this will be coming back before council for formal approval or formal input prior to approval of the plan. So this is just meant to be a high level status update of the project because it'll be coming forward in probably September, October. And so we wanted you to be aware of the baseline and foundation of it when we have that future discussion. So.
Good question. I think this is wonderful to hear, but could we put this on the agenda for later in, a month or so? Because I don't want to
Let's see how far we get. We have
rush through
30
because
minutes, 35
give a
minutes.
very long
Let's
agenda.
take- I
of
think they
the
should get started.
Yes, let's get started.
5
We'll
o'clock. We need
Wrap
to make
up
sure
at
we end.
around
Thank you.
5, so we are sure to have some time before our long meeting tonight. Go ahead.
All right. Mayor Norton, Council President Carlson, members of the council. My name is Aaron Luckstein. I'm the Deputy Public Works Director for Environmental Services within the Public Works Department. With me tonight is Troy Erickson. He's the Water Resources Manager, and we're going to be providing an update on the comprehensive surface water management plan. Again, this is meant to be a high level overview, just a status update. It'll be coming back to council in either September or October for formal input on the plan before we bring forth a recommendation for approval on the plan in towards the end of 2023. Just acknowledgement of our partners with this. So we are external consultants, our freshwater, Perkins and Will, EOR, and then internally it's being led by the Public Works Department with a lot of assistance from Parks Department, Lauren Jensen, sustainability side of things, as well as RPU and a lot of other city teammates. So over the next 20 to 30 minutes here, what we're going to do is walk through the major components of the planning process, some of the key accomplishments to date, as well as next steps to be expected in the process. We recognize a few of these slides have a lot of words. We're not going to read through all of those, but the reason we included them in is as we've gone through the public process, one of the things we've noticed is some people want time to be able to read, digest, come back later and ask questions. So a lot of the slides that you're seeing are the same slides that we used in public meetings, things like that. And we wanted to keep it consistent. One of the major components of the plan is actually the unique kind of iterated design process that we're going through to develop the plan. And what we're really using is kind of an iterative approach here, where we're using the core team and the planning team, which is really the water resources group. And then we expand it to some of the other experts within the city, the technical, and then even the broader global group, which we have representatives from the community on there. So representative from Rochester Area Builders, the Mayo Clinic, Destination Medical Center, some consulting firms, things like that. And so what we do as a core team is we develop the information. We then take it to those larger groups and say, are we on track? Does this meet your needs? Does it feel like a good process? And we kind of fine tune it, and we keep going through that iterative process until we get to the end. Part of the reason we're using this process is you'll notice it looks very similar to a continuous improvement plan, do, check, adapt process. So when we get into the implementation of the plan, people are familiar with this process, and we'll be able to evaluate the plan, its effectiveness well into the future, and be able to adjust as need be going forward. Quickly, just walking through the major components of the plan. Again, what you'll see in a few months, and that is some of the unique things is we did decide to include the entire drainage area. So we did look outside of Rochester, outside of the city limits, very much kind of coordinated with the growth management map, and even a little bit beyond that. Part of that is the coordination with the city's flood control system and the reservoirs outside of town, recognizing that what happens outside of town or outside of the city impacts both the water quality and the volume of water entering the city. And then also our responsibility as an upstream city impacting downstream users. So we're taking a big picture approach. But then within that, we also are carving it out by sub drainage districts. So looking at like Cascade Creek, for example, and Troy has a few examples of how we're looking at that, recognizing that there's a lot of similarities across these drainage districts, but also some key differences. And we need to treat each one a little bit different based on soil types, you know, the built environment that is already there, and having that unique kind of setup. We also emphasize, you'll see some of these are very similar to the city's strategic priorities. So social equity, climate resiliency, a co-benefits approach. So instead of just putting in gray infrastructure, a pond, and it's a singular benefit is rate control and water quality, is looking at, can there be other benefits such as recreational opportunities, wildlife habitat, things like that. So we're optimizing the use of that space. An integrated stormwater management approach that looks at both gray infrastructure, so pipes, ponds, things like that, as well as green infrastructures. And then managing natural assets, whether that's preserving sensitive lands, restoring lands, and how can we use all of those approaches to achieve the best outcome. And the final key piece is asset management. And again, that's across all three of those different systems. So not just gray infrastructure, but green and then natural assets. So with that, Troy, I'm going to turn it over to Troy. He's going to talk about some of the key accomplishments today.
All right, thank you. Again, I am Troy Erickson, Water Resources Manager with the City of Rochester, and thank you for having me today. As Aaron mentioned, I'm looking to just touch on, again, the major accomplishments that we've I guess, accomplished this point. Sorry for using that twice, but I just want to touch those on a high level and kind of walk you through where we're at. All right, and first thing I want to touch on is the establishment of plan drivers. So we've had, a substantial, effort to receive input from the community members, teammates, some council members and things like that. And we arrived at 5 drivers that very much define a very broad, but what we believe effective management plan. And those include quality of life and social equity, resilience and environmental stewardship, public waters and recreation, public and private infrastructure investment, and then fiscal responsibility and system sustainability. So all elements that serve, as a foundational basis for the plan. And again, just want to emphasize those relate to other plans, that the city operates with, as well as the strategic priorities and foundational principles of the city. The next accomplishment is our project website. Now, the website, we've learned, it's a lot of work to keep up. We also know that it is a very effective tool to communicate with the public, and that's what people relate to. So that's a big part of this, and something we plan to deliver this plan with and use as a tool to communicate, all of our goals and priorities and things like that, projects, so on and so forth. So something that is a mainstay of this initiative. The next thing I'd like to point out is the idea of pilot projects. So we've looked at redevelopment scenarios in, let's say, the downtown core, but we also looked at new development, things that we will see time and again in the city. So we use an example in Northwest Rochester, actually in the headwaters of the Kings Run drainage. It was called the Drainage District, the drainage area. Everyone should be familiar with that. That ultimately runs through like where Walmart North is and works its way out towards 60th Avenue to Douglas Trail. But within that, we looked at kind of a continuum of development scenarios ranging from just looking at gray infrastructure, where just a pond as a centerpiece to control rate and water quality, to actually dispersing that across the watershed, looking at how natural assets, so the wetlands and streams, can all work within that, looking at how soil types and different things all affect development. So with that, we've again looked at that comprehensively, and then also, as Aaron had mentioned, co-benefits. How do all these things relate for resilience and environmental stewardship? And also relating to, like, say, like parks and different things. So how do ponds and relate to recreational opportunities and things like that? So we're working on ways to develop policy that kind of shapes that and makes for better, more efficient development that meets our needs. And so moving on with that. Along with that is this idea of integrative stormwater management. So really, when I use that term, that's really just following how water runs across the landscape and how we actually treat that, how we manage that. So with development, oftentimes or imperviousness that's placed on the landscape, there's more runoff, but we want to limit that runoff and really try to infiltrate that as much as we can and improve water quality as a result. So with that, we have these three major categories: gray infrastructure, so that's the basic things, the ponds, the pipes, and things like that, and then green infrastructure, so like rain guards and things that actually allow water to infiltrate and mimic natural processes within the built environment. And the one big thing we want to emphasize is just the natural assets, the value that's there with what's already in place, right? And trying to, not only improve, but augment that and in some cases restore. So those are big things that we're looking to explore and incorporate within this plan, the idea of integrative stormwater management. Okay. The next accomplishment is this idea of risk assessment. Now, you can see here, there's a fairly, I'll say, complicated kind of flow chart, but really breaking into phases what we're attempting to do here. So first and foremost, we had phase one of this development of this comprehensive surface water management plan. What kind of set the stage, just looking at the city as a whole, that available and that kind of thing. But with that came the need to really, set the stage for how we look at the city. And that really, I guess through that initiative, we arrived at looking at the what we're going to call a drainage district, or 10 drainage districts throughout the city, which basically are drainage areas about the tributaries of the city. 9 of those that include like Badger Run, Cascade Creek, so on and so forth. And then, of course, the drainage area that surrounds the South Fork Zumbro River that runs through the city. So within that, though, we really wanted to establish a priority, because we can't look at all of those drainage districts at once. It's too huge. So we looked at a number of different metrics to arrive at basically a way to rank those, look at those, including, social aspects like environmental justice areas, environmental issues, and things like that. So with that, Cascade Creek, the Cascade Creek Watershed District, watershed became the priority drainage district. And that also coincides, just as a side note, coincides with a 319 grant that the city is actually working with county partners and others for investment through the EPA and whatnot for future projects. So that was another reason why we arrived at that. But just kind of cut to the chase with that, this risk assessment also, it provides a means for us to prioritize and develop capital improvement projects that are ranked accordingly, according to need, and those, trying to help those areas or people where it's needed most. So it's a novel approach, and one we intend to implement, through each drainage district, throughout the city. All right. The next, another, basically digging a little further with the risk assessment. We have, again, kind of a sequence of how we will look at each watershed, and starting with an evaluation system, and that evaluation system will come through what we're going to term an H&H model, so a hydrologic and hydraulic model. So it's like a digital representation of desktop, the representation of the city using a computer program, and again, seeing how water runs across the landscape and what bottlenecks there are, flooding issues, things like that. So through that, you can see there's a number of different steps, but basically looking at the system, seeing where there are bottlenecks, flooding issues, concerns like that, understanding what the impacts of those deficiencies are, and then evaluating the consequences of those. And those consequences are important for establishing priorities in terms of projects and things that we can do. Part of that evaluation comes down to, again, three kind of general categorizations of metrics that we're looking at that are based around infrastructure, environmental aspects, and social aspects. So we're looking at all those with respect to any one part of the city, if you will. And you can see there's a number of different details there, but those are ranked. They're weighted accordingly, and it all takes into account our it's a categorization of consequence. So, and there are some greater details here that I'm kind of skipping over in the interest of time, but it all comes in the way of trying to establish a numerical ranking for these areas of the city. The next component we looked at, not necessarily in this order, but is the storm sewer capacity, or basically conveyance capacity. So we've all seen roadways that have flooded because the sewer is too small, or streams that are choked, that cause flooding. So things like that. And we're using storm sewer as an example of that. We also look at old. We understand that they're older parts of the city were designed with older standards than what are today. So those are reasons for that as well. So it's just a way of looking at infrastructure, I guess, built gray infrastructure, but also natural assets, streams and whatnot, with respect to, the amount of flow that's coming through it. Okay. But ultimately, what we're looking to do here is categorize, again, the sub catchments within the city. I'll have a figure that shows us a little more closely, but we're trying to categorize this in terms of risk. And you can see on the chart that I provided up there, we have a consequence, which is a number one, basically numerical value that's rated 1 through 5, and then a scale on the x-axis, the bottom axis, that relates to frequency. So with that, depending on where the value ranks, there's an associated risk ranging from a low risk up to a high risk. Okay, and I'll dig into that a little further. And if you look all the way to the right, you'll see Cascade Watershed. There's basically the map of that drainage area, and you can see it's broken into, I believe it's, actually I don't know the exact number, but just say it's 50 some sub catchments, sub areas in that it's districtized. Within each one of those areas, a risk has been developed for that, and each risk has been established for each one of the metrics we established for infrastructure, societal issues, as well as environmental issues. That's what's shown on the left side, and then we kind of walk through that. And it all culminates in what we're seeing on the right side that indicates where are areas of greatest risk. So the areas where more people are affected, there's critical infrastructure, there's homes, that potentially touched by flooding, things like that. And I think the unique aspect of this is we're not always looking at, say, like the 100-year event. We're looking at more frequent events, storms that happen every 2 years that maybe become more of a nuisance for more people, things like that, than just the big event that we always think of. So that's kind of the novel thing here, because we don't always see, not all people always, call in when there's drainage issues, things like that. So this is a way of kind of seeing through that. course, we always have to field check that and make sure that that what we're seeing on the desktop, works with reality, but it's a novel way of looking at that. Okay, and this is, again, a representation, just how that risk changes with return frequency, so the magnitude of events. And basically you see, when we go from a 2-year all the way to the 100-year, we see how kind of that risk subsides. And that's really a function of the fact that 100-year event's supposed to happen one time in 100 years. Now, everyone has a little different opinion on that, but in any case, so this doesn't in any way, neglect, those large storms or whatnot. But again, it's a way of kind of teasing out some of the issues that arise more frequently. All right. And one of the really exciting aspects of the work we're doing is the development of these hydrologic models. And not to get into too many details, but we are looking at one-dimensional and two-dimensional models. So we see how water flows across the landscape. I don't know if that's an issue. Okay. If how it flows across the landscape. And with that, we're able to really, again, kind of hone in on problem areas, and with minimal effort, come to conclusions or see how things kind of really fit together within the city and arrive at problems. That's proved useful already in parts of Cascade Creek with different property owners and things like that. So that's something that will prove useful. And our intent is to develop these models throughout the city and utilize that for development of capital projects, addressing concerns and when we receive complaints and things like that, just a way of arriving at solutions faster and more efficiently. And I'd say the other thing too is one thing that as it relates to development, oftentimes when developers would come to us, we'd have to put the onus of establishing some of this information on them. And with establishing the models, we'll be able to be more responsive and be able to speak to them and put less work on them to arrive at sound solutions to development. So that's an exciting aspect as well. So with that being said, our next steps will include completing the flood risk assessment along with the hydrologic and hydraulic models. So again, that pertains to the Cascade Creek model that I discussed. We're I would say about 90% through with that initiative, and we're actually at the point where we're looking at specific projects for inclusion in our capital improvement plan. Also, part of this plan has been the development of a community resilience hub. So that was a goal of our sustainability and resilience community work plan that Lauren Jensen and others helped develop. And so it was a great collaborating opportunity with her to do that. So the modeling work helped inform placement of the community resilience hub. And there was a significant effort, a co-design effort to reach out to community members, throughout for understanding general guidelines. What are the needs and desires of the community for such resources as that? The next step will be to complete plan based on priority sub-watershed results and update the web page. So again, more along what I already said. And as Aaron had mentioned, ultimately to seek approval, on the plan from yourselves there as well. So with that being said, I've mentioned, this idea of the 10 drainage districts, and we're working through Cascade Creek, and we've worked through another one as part of the pilot project that Kings Run. But with that, we're going to continue. We want to work through the remaining drainage districts in this fashion, again, to inform our capital improvement plan and ultimately to best serve our residents and community members for increased water quality. We understand how important that is, but also protecting residents from flood conditions and making things, even just the nuisance conditions that can really have detrimental effects on everyone. And along with that, a big part of this has been asset management. So this modeling effort, we learned a lot about the information we have in GIS format and things like that. We understand where improvements lie. but making better decisions based on hard data versus reactionary, being proactive versus reactive, things like that. And as I mentioned, a lot of this ultimately comes back to our capital improvement plan, having an informed, objective plan that prioritizes those projects based on true need. So, yeah. And finally, now this is perhaps a little bit out of order, but this is the representation of the city with respect to those 10 drainage districts I mentioned. And this will really kind of summarizes our plan of approach. So you can see Cascade Creek was, currently what we've modeled in 2023, and then we moved down to the southeast part of the city. And again, these were based on a large scale prioritization, where we include like Willow Creek, Game Haven, Badger Run, Bear Creek, and Mayo Run, and then we move to the north. Also, recognizing in 2024, there's some parts of the South Fork Zumba River that does include some of the downtown areas, just as we, continue to develop with projects related to DMC and otherwise, the importance of staying in front of development and working through that. So with that, I believe Aaron and I are open for questions. Thank you.
Well, this is fantastic. It's so great to see this. Thank you for all your work on this. And I had a couple of quick questions, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues. First of all, we are talking tonight about our sales tax extent or renewal. Is the floodwater piece of the local sales tax extension potential to provide funding for some of these capital improvement, or how are these linked together? I'm looking at Aaron, but I don't know who wants to answer it. This Aaron.
Want me to field that?
Sorry, I was gonna defer to Cindy or you.
So as part of this comprehensive service water management plan, we are taking into consideration the flood control system because of it's interconnected within the city and how water moves through the city. And some of this information could certainly be used to help determine future projects that are needed as part of that, which then ties into the funding for the local option sales tax. So this would provide information that can aid into the determination of those future projects.
Good.
So
Okay.
that answer your question?
Yes. All right. And then the other piece is, as we're looking at different parts of the city and developments being proposed, how do you work with developers and providing them information for an area of the city that you haven't yet reviewed?
Good question. So obviously, if we don't have the information, as part of these models, that the part of that just isn't information that we can provide, we would go through the standard process, which may be they might have to develop their own model to be able to model the impact that development would have on those downstream water bodies. Obviously, we have our current engineering design standards, the requirements of the UDC that every development needs to walk through and ensure that they're meeting those requirements based on the best available information that they have. As we build out these models and have them available, that will just be able to provide additional information. And as Troy said, perhaps reduce some of the expense that is placed on development in areas where there is concerns with some of the modeling that is needed.
Great, fantastic. All right, Mayor Norton, then Councilmember Keen.
Thank you. The UDC was actually part of what I was thinking about as I was watching or reading through a couple of these earlier, and I really appreciate the work that you've gone into and the modeling that you've done. On the page that has 68 in my packet, it says it has the green infrastructure and natural assets. And when I first came to the community, there was something called CUDE, which we ended up sunsetting because it was dysfunctional. But I believe part of the CUDE's job was to look at some of these aspects in design. And I'm feeling a little concerned that if we have a UDC, but it doesn't have a lot of incentives, or what I had hoped to be in there, which is incentives to do some of these things that you're suggesting. We may do them as a city, but there's a lot of private developers out there and we want to incent them to do it too. So I'm wondering, is there any way we can incentivize people to do some of the things you've identified? And then I have one other question that's a little more sensitive.
So I can't speak to the Q history
Nope, that
part of
was
this, but.
Before your time,
so-
my time.
Yep, and the focus of today's presentation was to stay high level, give a status update of where we're at. We have not gotten to the point where we have recommendations for how to implement that, and I don't want to misspeak and project on something that then doesn't come forward. So at this point, I guess I'll be
Yep.
more prepared to answer that question when a recommendation comes forward in September as to whether it is an incentive, whether it's a mandate, how we would recommend implementing some of these things. Now, with that said, keep in mind, there are many of these things are already in the UDC and in our design standards. So there are development requirements related to making sure that we don't impact wetlands, or if there is, there's wetland mitigation, not developing within floodplain, those types of things,
We talk
looking
about
at
those
sensitive
here at the
areas.
board table
So,
sometimes.
yep, so some of that is already built into this, and we're looking at really how do we package all of those things together perhaps in a better way, so.
Thank you. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to say it's something I really hope we look at moving ahead and can strengthen it. And the second one's a little more sensitive, but it has to do with the same slide, which is retention basins and ponds. Is there anything we can do in the kind of terrain and climate that we have to mitigate vehicles and other people from getting into ponds? Have we thought about that? Or should we?
Or all the geese that are breeding in them?
So so this, again, this is not part of the comprehensive surface water management plan, getting into that level of detail. So we haven't looked at that in terms of just location of them. We kind of do look at public safety factors, things of that nature when evaluating proposals. So.
I think we'll,
Good enough.
good enough. Move on. Councilmember Kane.
Yeah, and I appreciate kind of going through this in a little more detail. It's funny the number of times I see it, I start catching on a little more each time. I want to understand when you talk about these H&H and these models, and I've heard the word desktop. Am I to understand that we sort of map the topography of these areas and the capabilities, and then like the input say, what if you got 6 inches of rain over 24 hours? Is that what we're doing? Am I understanding that correctly?
Correct. Very similar to that. So we're able to do is we can input certain storm events. We can say, based on what we know of the infrastructure that's in place, the amount of impervious surface versus pervious surface, the soil types, things like that. We can say what happens if we get a 6-inch rain over a 24-hour period, how will the system respond?
Okay.
And so then we're able to evaluate, is there a backup in the system? Are properties flooded? Things like that. And we can model those different scenarios to evaluate, the impact and
I
how
mean, to
well the
have those
system will perform.
type of assets in the city would be helpful. I don't know the cost of trying to maintain them, but again, I think that would be a valuable tools to have.
Correct. And then the nice thing about it is you can also then input various solutions and evaluate those on how
Okay.
those solutions would perform under those same scenarios, and then be able to determine what would the true cost be. And you can kind of provide that range that says, look, if we want to provide X level of protection, it's going to be this expensive. Maybe we don't want to go to that extreme, but here's a more reasonable.
And not just using
path
these
forward.
gray infrastructure as the go-to solutions.
Yeah, right. One thing that, again, not as much for the presentation, but for my peers here, there's also such a thing as a South Zumbro Watershed Joint Powers Board. And some of my peers and I are on that with county people and with soil and water. And Council President Carlson, the thing you talk about, like, how are we going to fund these things and how are we going to prioritize them is a lot of what we've been trying to look at. But really, we as a joint powers are really just trying to manage the existing ones. It really is this group or the soil and water that are going to be looking at this and saying, what are these next investments? So I appreciate getting through this today. Thank you.
Any final comments, questions? Otherwise, perfect timing. Great work, great presentation. Thank you so much. Look forward to what you come up with for the fall.
All right. Thank you for your time and questions. Thank you.
Great. Ms. Elm, study session schedule.
Thank you, Council President, Council Members, Mayor Norton. Just want a quick reminder that on the 17th of July, so this coming Monday, we'll kick off here with the high level baseline budget where we're sitting there. for 2024, as well as deeper dive into the capital improvement plan. So spend some time on that. We'll take a break and then go to the bus tour. At each of your places is the menu. So you could please make a selection. We need to make that order by Thursday morning. And then just a update that what is listed for July 24th, which says Mayo 5-year plan update, that should be a Mayo update on their plans for their Unbound project. So it'll be more about that project. The 5-year plan update will come on a future meeting, but just for clarification, that's not the 5-year plan, it's their plans. So that's all I have. Just want to, again, ask those who have already turned in their meal selection appreciated. If not, you can email or turn that in this evening. We preferred. Thanks.
All right, we'll see everyone back at 7 o'clock.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.